Finland and Sweden, two smaller countries of a northern European periphery, closely connected, not only geographically but also historically. Similar in many ways, but also different. How has this affected the role of history and the historians? We went to Helsinki and asked one of Finland's most well-known and celebrated historians, Oula Silvennoinen at Helsinki University. Welcome to our YouTube channel, and we're having coffee.
Yep, cheers.
Yes. Did you study at Yale?
I know, that's from some conference.
Your thesis was about Einsatzkommando Finnland, which uncovered completely new knowledge regarding Finland during the Second World War. Your career really got kick-started.
Well, you might say, yeah. It's always good to discover something completely new. When I found my topic, I also thought that, well, yes, another title regarding Finland's war, and it's probably been the most written about topic in the post-war era. But as I also had found out that there is certainly a gap in our knowledge regarding especially the doings of the Finnish security police during the war, I felt confident enough to take up that topic.
Einsatzkommando Finnland. What was Einsatzkommando Finnland?
It was a similar kind of unit that the SS set up everywhere in anticipation of the coming war with the Soviet Union, and the larger ones were called Einsatzgruppen.
1941.
Yes, in the spring 1941. The larger ones were called Einsatzgruppen, and they were further divided in smaller Einsatzkommandos. And it had been supposed that for some reason Finland was exempt from this practice, but as it turned out, it wasn't. There was also an Einsatzkommando which was set up in June 1941 with the German army in Norway, and which came into Finland in the German-controlled theater of war in Finnish Lapland and operated against the Soviet Union with the precisely same purpose and same aim as the Einsatzgruppen further south. That was to destroy the supposed mainstays of the Soviet society, active communists, Soviet officials, and what turned out to be most important, any and all Jews.
Jews, exactly. Yes. So what you did basically was something that one, as an historian, wasn't supposed to do. You linked Finland with the process of the Holocaust, and myself, I entered Finnish history writing when I published my book about the Swedish foreign minister, Christian Günther, and I published that in 2006.
You did.
And I found myself in a hornet's nest, which I didn't anticipate at all. I didn't know how sensitive this was. I was being interviewed by television companies in Helsinki Sanomat, and Finnish historians wrote articles about me, which wasn't very flattering.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I didn't understand what was happening at all as being Swedish. I couldn't really fathom what is this. So what did happen to me?
You touched upon one of the most treasured items in the post-war history culture of Finland, which had a deep connection to Finland's relationship to the Soviet Union after the war. And that entailed that Finland had fought against the Soviet Union, but the alliance with Germany wasn't really an alliance, and it was a kind of relationship where Finland always kept Germany at arm's length and never became entangled in the German way of making war or the German aims of making war against the Soviet Union. And that was an important thing to bring up, and whenever there was when this topic was brought up from the Soviet side, so that you could say that, well, yeah, we fought, but we were not out there to destroy the Soviet Union, and we had nothing to do with the Holocaust or any other German atrocities.
This field of conflict,
Mhm.
which does not only encompass historians but also the government.
A historian is always interested and fascinated when they are able to discover something new, and I think that was the main feeling that drove me on as well.
Where does this interest come from of yours? How come you are interested in these specific? You have written books about Finnish fascism.
Mhm.
You have written a recent book about Frändefolkskrigen. How do you call it? The tribal wars.
Oh,
or something?
heimosodat, yeah, that's or kindred nations wars or something. It doesn't really translate terribly well into English.
And you've been interested in the Civil War, as I understand it, and you're also conducting Holocaust studies, and you've been to Israel, and sort of contributing to the transnational research there.
Yeah.
You seem to be focused upon, can one say, the darker sides of Finnish 20th century?
You could say so, yeah. I found myself drawn into and fascinated over the most sensitive parts of the recent past, of the recent history. In Finland, that includes all the wars and crises of the 20th century, of which there were a few. And I found that these topics still are very politicized and therefore very sensitive, very, very divisive issues. And that's, at least to me, something that really inflames my interest. And I want to find out why.
The relation between Finnish history, 20th century history, modern history if you want to, and Swedish 20th century history. To me, as being Swedish, there is a strong link. There's a lot of communication, there's a lot of diplomatic relations, economic ties, military relations, and there is some sort of strange relationship between Finland after being born in 1917 and Sweden, where Sweden on one hand wonders, can this state survive? Is it viable? Can it handle itself? Is it strong enough? There is a Swedish anti-Finnish racism always present. Swedes looking down upon Finns but at the same time a sort of Swedish admiration for the Finnish masculinity, which I think dates back from the imperial days of Sweden, maybe the 17th century, the Hakkapelite, the able Finnish soldier, and so on and so forth. And during the Second World War, there is a huge interest in the Swedish Foreign Office of what happens in Finland, what are they doing in Finland, what's going on.
Understandably, yes.
Yes. We get a new type of government in 1939, not because of the outbreak of the Second World War, but because of the outbreak of the Winter War, and there is a strong mobilization in Sweden. You have to support the Finns, and this shocks the government. At the same time, when one looks at Finland, one can see that there is always a strong interest in what's going on in Sweden. Can we get support in Sweden? Frändefolkskrigen, is how Swedish people coming to Finland and so forth. Is there any way to, and please take your time, to describe the 20th century relationship, well, one can say from 1917 to 1944, I guess.
Well, that's a task, yeah. But I think you outlined much of it already, that Finland and Sweden have been very, very close, tied together by a multitude of different ties. The smallest of which certainly isn't the fact that Finland also harbored a significant Swedish-speaking population, which has always made it sort of easier to maintain the relations and has made Sweden something more than just a foreign country, and much more. you can see these ties on every level, from politics to economical life and of course to other fields of life as well. That's not a surprise. And where Sweden and Finland went different paths during the 20th century was just that Finland was the part that was exposed to the Soviet Union and its growing might, and Sweden could, well, sort of hedge its bets, see what the outcome will be, and let the Finns pluck the chestnuts from the fire if at all possible. And therefore, as I've understood, there never was a significant support for any ideas of a political or state level union or deeper cooperation with Finland and Sweden, as Swedes understood that they don't want to be drawn into someone else's wars or conflicts or crises if they can avoid it, which is of course entirely sane real politics, but something that the Finns didn't really understand or appreciate, because they understood that the relationship between Sweden and Finland is a special one.
One can almost sense that Finland, after 1917, with the notion of Suursuomi, Greater Finland, is sort of negotiating with itself. Should we be a nation state or a sort of mini empire?
It did, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, the Finnish nationalism had, ever since the 19th century, harbored this idea that, of course, which was an idea that was so common to every other nationalism as well, that the natural borders of the state of Finland lie somewhere where Finnic languages are spoken, and therefore the geographic area of what Finland ought to be were something entirely different than what Finland was on the map at the time of its gaining independence in 1917, or what they ever had been. And this idea rather faithfully, after the collapse of the Russian Empire and Finnish independence, was given a period in which it appeared realistic, that it could actually be realized if we just act now and act forcefully enough. And that led a significant part of the Finnish population to harbor ideas of territorial aggrandizement and the creation of a greater Finland that would become the leading state in the Nordic countries and would really rise the Finnish nation to its proper place in the world. Very, very common ideas among nationalist thinking at the time, of course, but also thoughts that inevitably led to conflict in a rather interesting way, as the most hot-headed visions of Finnish nationalism did not just include Eastern Karelia, which was a staple that was usually envisioned to, in any case, belong to the future Greater Finland, but also Estonia, Ingria with St. Petersburg smack in the middle, the Kola Peninsula, and the Finnmark area from Norway, inhabited since the 17th century by a Finnish-speaking population, and of course also the Västerbotten from Sweden.
Yes.
And so the attempt to realize such
and sometimes Hungary.
Well, yeah, but at least that was geographically distant enough so that I'm not aware that anybody envisioned a real common state with the Hungarians. But at least an attempt to realize this greater Finland would have led Finland into conflict with every neighboring state, including Sweden, and that's just
And we touch upon the main difference between Swedish national identity, I guess, in the 20th century and early 20th century, and Finnish national identity, since Sweden was very confident within some sort of borders. Well-established nation state. Christian Günther, the foreign minister during the Second World War in Sweden, which I have studied, he once said that the luck of the Swedes began in Poltava in 1709, when Sweden basically lost its empire and sort of retreated into, we're not going to have any foreign offensive adventures, and then they did, of course. But
Yeah.
it's an interesting notion for a Swede to say in Swedish luck began in Poltava 1709, 1709, while Finland was sort of negotiating within these notions. You can compare to Norway, which is founded roughly at the same time as Finland, but they're on the west coast of Scandinavia, so they don't have to really enter that self-negotiation. So should we attack eastwards or should we confide?
Yeah, not on the same level certainly, but you would have found from Sweden people who certainly didn't think that Sweden, as it was in, say, 1917, was the Sweden that should be, or there were people who were still dreaming about the return of the great power status and the pushing Sweden's border somewhere and taking control of the Baltic Sea again, as Gustav Adolf had done. And likewise in Norway, they certainly were much more modest in the ambitions of Norwegian nationalism, but still there were people who dreamt of a Norwegian empire dominating the North Atlantic and the coastal areas and including the Kola Peninsula and partially same areas as the Finnish nationalists were dreaming of.
Clash of them.
Indeed, yeah.
Yes.
There was a real clash during the Second World War when the paper of National Samling in Norway published a map which showed the future Greater Norway, which included all the northern coast of the Barents Sea and the Kola Peninsula as being part of the future great state of Norway, and which caused in Finland, consternation, you might say.
Yes, and Quisling being a sort of subordinate of Nazi Germany and Finland having a relationship to Nazi Germany.
Yeah.
Typical, isn't it?
Yeah, and during the war, the most ardent supporters of Finnish-German cooperation, they really thought that Germany is going to give Finland all these areas from eastern Karelia, including the Kola Peninsula, and maybe also Finnmark from Norway, which, of course, yeah.
In the autumn of 1940, there is a notion in a relationship between Finland and Sweden that Finland into some part should enter some sort of personal union, which is conceived in Sweden as now we're getting back Finland. And this is the Swedish right, which goes basically bananas about this idea, and they love it, and they never stop dreaming of it. This is Gösta Bagge, the Swedish right leader, who is but he's very marginalized in Swedish politics, I would say. He's not a successful politician at all, and he has great troubles in sort of negotiating power. Whereas the radical right in Finland is not to be tampered with after 1918. The white legacy is what it is. Could we see a difference here that the workings of a radical right in Finland after 1918 has been a political power to be reckoned with, but whereas the radical right in Sweden after 1918 has been marginalized until today, I would say.
Yeah, if you think of the interwar period, radical right in Finland, you will see that its potential power was constantly shifting and uncertain, really, where the majority of Finns entered with the political solution of 1919 that included the creation of Finland as a republic, definitely into the path of moderate politics and a return to normalcy, and which marginalized the most radical members of the right, those who thought that the Republic of Finland was a betrayal of what the whites in 1918 had fought for in the Finnish Civil War. But you can't say that these people would have been terribly influential in Finnish politics. But then They interestingly regain political influence before and during the Winter War, when they are thought to form a vital channel to Germany and Hitler's government to gain support from Nazi Germany to Finland's struggle, without really realizing that Hitler had actually, well, he had just done the opposite. He had signed Finland off and sold it to the Soviet Union, who were at the time his real ally. Yes, in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. But even moderate, cool-headed Finnish politicians let, for a brief period of time, the Finnish National Socialists and other radical rightists to behave as if they would have a channel to Hitler's government, and as they might gain something important for Finland from Germany.
You've written a book about Finnish fascism.
I have,
Yes, and the primary object of this study is, of course, the Lappua movement, in Swedish Lappo-rörelsen, which, to me, having studied international fascism in a comparative way, not the least Swedish fascism, is, although it's a failure in Finland, it is remarkably successful in a Nordic perspective. While, for example, the Swedish Nazi parties together reached 0.6% in 1936, I believe. This is a movement it gained some sort of informal control over the Finnish government in 1930 to 1932, and then it behaves stupidly, and there's a putsch, and they fail. But still, they are remarkably successful in a Nordic context.
You could say so, but as a fascist movement, which I think the Lappua at heart was, you might say that they became the victims of their own success, because they were able to put pressure on the government precisely because they were able to present themselves for a time as a rather level-headed, rather moderate mass movement that could attract actual mass support, which they were able to do until 1930, late 1930, 1931. And it was during this period that they were really able to push through important changes in legislation, which, however, satiated those more modern members or supporters of the movement. It seemed to them that the movement had really managed to attain its goals, and they were not ready to support the more wide-reaching aims of the fascist core of the leadership of the movement, and therefore the mass support started to wane in late 1930, 1931, with as the movement also turned increasingly violent and increasingly lawless.
Well, it never found its true leadership.
No, you could say so, that the Vihtori Kosola, who was the movement's figurehead, he seemed imposing.
Kosolini.
Yeah, indeed, he seemed imposing enough. His credentials as a far-right leader were impeccable. Really, he was a veteran of the Finnish Civil War. He had served time in a Russian prison because he had participated in the underground movement behind the Finnish Jägers, and in that way he had been consistent in his political aims, and he was something of a speaker as well, and could cut a very forceful figure in the manner of Mussolini, whom he seems to have consciously aped, and into whose mold they really tried to cast him as well. And
one surprising thing about the Lappua movement is I don't see many connections to Sweden. There's more Poland and Lithuania, maybe. One could think that there would be, as it had been during the Civil War, Swedish volunteers and tribal wars. What
Yeah.
did we
Well,
agree? What
Frändefolkskriget, yeah.
Frändefolkskriget,
Yeah.
that's right.
Yeah.
Sweden is important, and one can channel.
That's true. Yeah.
But with the Lapo movement, it's sort of anti-Swedish even.
Well, no, not really. Finnish far right was throughout the interwar period riven by the question of language, which was, of course, a wider point of struggle in the contemporary Finnish society, whether Finland will be Finnish-speaking or whether Swedish language will continue to have a significant position in the Finnish society. And considerable parts of the far right were of the idea that Finland should be only a Finnish-speaking country, and the influence of the Swedish language should be terminated. So you couldn't, for example, have university teaching in Swedish.
When your work about Finnish fascism was published, you got into a conflict with Finnish politicians regarding whether or not to understand the Lapo movements as a fascist movement.
Yeah, well, at the time we had the Perussuomalaiset, the Finnish far-right party in the government, and some of their politician who was also has a background in history tried to somehow challenge our interpretation, but
What was the point?
I think his point was, probably that Lapo movement cannot be called fascist, which was also the point made by one professor of history here. But I do think that's a confused argument. The movement can very well be characterized and recognized as fascist if you go to see what the members of its leadership wrote. That's a sort of an easy thing to do.
It's sort of obvious, isn't it?
Yes, but
as a Swede, I found the discussion very strange.
Indeed, but the Finland has a troubled history in the post-war era of using the word fascist at all. So that because it was so much wielded by the Soviet Union in their propaganda and used as a sort of label to anybody whom the Soviets disagreed with, and so I think there was a large segment of the Finnish society which became sort of allergic to the use of the term at all, and I can sort of understand from where they come, but that's not supported by modern research on fascism, which certainly maintains that fascism is a term that can be used of certain modern political movements as well.
Well, I've been into the same sort of argument in Sweden, as you know, and
Yes.
we were together at the conference
Yeah.
where there was a person very angry about the sort of modern usage of a term fascism as interpreted by researchers like Roger Griffin and Robert Paxton and so on.
I remember that, yeah. I don't really quite understand the argument, and so what I've been also telling my students is that fascism is a strain of political thought that has been with us since the 19th century, but in earnest under that label since the early 20th century.
Yeah, 100 years.
Its history doesn't end with the Second World War. Say the fascist movements have been quite able to sort of reinvent themselves and come back under different guises, usually not calling themselves fascist because the word is so loaded, but it's quite okay to use it as a description of their ideology.
That's a part of our problem, that we study fascism so much, so it becomes sort of, it's part of everyday life as someone working with fascism, and then you sort of reminded, this is a sensitive word, and it's also, of course,
that's very true.
Something you call people you don't like.
It's for many people, it's so loaded with meaning that it's very difficult to sort of make them understand that we as researchers we're using it in a neutral sense, simply as a description of a very certain type of political idea or ideologies which can be recognized, can be characterized, and can be classified as fascist.
Exactly. You have also written an article which I read about the current political development in Europe and otherwise concerning the radical right, one can guess, ultranationalism, which is right-wing populism, traditional authoritarian right, and also neo-fascism and Nazism and so on and so forth. And you also involved yourself politically in the political life of Finland, as I understand it.
Yeah.
In the Green Party.
I joined the Green Party of Finland, yes, I did. Mostly motivated simply from what I've seen in my research and that the far right is trying to reinvent itself again and bring itself into the mainstream politics, and that's something that I think is alarming and should be opposed by everybody who has a clear head.
But how do you differ your roles? Doesn't this open you up for criticism? That is
well, yeah, but they used to criticize me before that I was a communist because I wrote what I wrote. Now they're criticizing that I write what I write because I'm a green. So it doesn't really change anything.
No,
it's a perverse idea that we as citizens couldn't be politically active while we're pursuing careers in research. And the idea of democracy is that we, the people, are quite capable of governing ourselves, and therefore it should be quite okay that we're also members of political parties, and those of us who have a brain in their head realize that it's quite possible to separate the roles of a researcher or a political activist. They are two different things. It's an absurd thought that researchers shouldn't or couldn't have political opinions. Of course they do. And is it better to have political opinions that you hide from the public and play and sort of try to appear as someone who's above politics, which is weird in the extreme.
One of the things, I have a small idea though. After 1945, the historians of Sweden sort of dethroned themselves. They've been very much involved with the creation of a modern nation state in the 19th century, which is mainly why they even existed. Sort of the history of a nation demands the nation's historians. But after 1945 in Sweden, they went back into the universities and conducted the research, and they weren't anymore involved in sort of the political struggle of a nation state. Why that was not the case, I would argue, in Finland in 1945. The historians still was public figures.
Oh yes.
Korhonen, for example.
Oh yes.
Korhonen,
yes.
In sort of in the service of the fatherland, I would.
Indeed, yes. Nation building continued, and people like Korhonen, they were very much involved in creating the post-war version of, for example, Finland's war, what they had been about, why they had been fought, how they had been fought, and what were their consequences, and if that's not political, I don't know what is.
You were called into the service of your country as an historian.
Indeed. I think the Finnish historical profession was very conscious of its role in helping to steer the nation in the shadow of the Soviet Union. So it was sort of fleshing out a narrative that was defensible enough and not offensive to the Soviet Union, and not something that, for example, the Finnish far left could have used in their politics. And I do think they were quite happy actually with the results, and it worked very well.
I talked to some senior people at the Stockholm University historical department of the Stockholm University regarding what really happened to me in 2006, which sort of surprised not only me but many Swedish historians as well. They were sort of shocked. What was something really happened? There was sort of a huge queue, a line of Finnish television companies, magazines, newspapers, radio reporters standing in my stairway waiting. I was of course completely shocked.
Wow. Yeah.
And Finnish government stated that I was basically a liar or something like that.
Yeah.
And I didn't understand anything as being Swedish. One of my senior professors said that the Finnish historians are now being called into the defense of the nation, that they are to attack you. Because when I read the articles being written about me by Finnish historians, I couldn't understand them. It was what's the point? I was sort of looking for where am I wrong?
Yeah.
Because I was thinking that I was wrong because I didn't know much about Finnish history, having written about it from a Swedish perspective. But one of my senior professors told me that now there's a sort of a mobilization here, but because you're a Swedish and you're sort of doing something.
I think he hit close to the, or she, whether...
You think so?
He hit close to the mark, yeah. You were a non-Finn who dared to somehow criticize Finland or put Finland in bad light, and that's something you're not supposed to do, because non-Finns can't understand the history of Finland. Only Finns can understand it properly and interpret it properly. And if you think about that thought, it smacks, it's really a Cold War thought.
Oh, yes.
Because you need to have the monopoly of interpreting Finnish history in your hands. Otherwise, there will be foreigners who come to, accuse you of, what have you, Finlandization. Didn't go down very well in Finland, that team either. Or cooperation with Nazi Germany, directly dangerous material. And you wouldn't listen to that from any foreigner. You were simply receiving a belated reaction which told you of the Cold War mentality.
Oh. You once told us at a seminar when I was listening to you that Finland's splendid isolation must end.
Indeed.
And that Finnish academics should be, to a larger extent, be writing in English. Which they did.
Yeah, nowadays we're doing that as well, yeah.
I very much remember your statements, Finland's splendid isolation.
The point was that especially after the Second World War, Finland was both blessed and cursed by the fact that we speak Finnish, a language which has a very few speakers and not really close linguistic relatives, if you don't count Estonia and some groups in, maybe it's not close, you won't understand a word of Hungarian. So, and that left also the Finnish historians to sort of flesh out the story by themselves. There were not many foreign researchers who could have said anything about Finnish history because they couldn't read the sources. And sort of it gave you the monopoly that was useful in the Cold War era. You could sort of have it in the national hand to interpret Finland's history and angrily denounce every foreigner who tried to say anything critical of it. There were some, but the reaction with all of them was the same. And of course the downside is that you get a very isolated history culture that is very centered on the national narrative, and that's something that in the post-Soviet era I think we urgently need to get rid of. It doesn't serve us anymore in any way.
I would say that Finnish society is very much interested in what's going on in Sweden. They read Swedish newspapers and so on. So
likewise, yeah.
Yes. But Swedes generally are extremely uninterested in what's going on in Finland, Denmark and Norway.
Excepting when it comes to history and the war.
The capital of Scandinavia,
yes.
as Stockholm calls itself. Some sort of... we're so much bigger and smarter, and we have Volvo cars.
Yeah, but as with many myths, it has a great deal of justification, of course, and so. But what I found interesting, fascinating, is the sort of intense interest in Finland's modern history, especially when it comes to the wars and crises that we do have. I've had several of my books translated into Swedish in Sweden. And it obviously means that there's a market for them.